Hi, and welcome back to Knit Your Stress Away, your podcast all around cozy yarn, knitting needles, stress relief, all the things. Okay, deep breath. We're going to talk about something that sounds boring. You may have had knitters talk about it in a super boring way and kind of waved it off, but it's actually super empowering once you understand it. And we are talking about gauge. If you've ever spent hours knitting something that turned out either way too small or way too big, this is the episode that will help you avoid that mistake in the future. Let's go for it. Welcome to Knit Your Stress Away, the podcast for overwhelmed moms who are done with doom scrolling and ready for something slower. Hi, I am Nadine. I am a mom, a knitting coach for beginners, and proud screen time dropout who believes that peace starts with just one stitch. If you've ever craved a quiet moment to yourself, this show is your cozy permission slip. Let's trade notifications for needles and turn stress into self-care together. Okay, let's get into this topic. It's something that you may have heard people talk about as a unnecessary thing or as something that they don't enjoy doing or something that they don't think is necessary. So let's talk about gauge today and what it means and why you need to check your gauge before you actually dive into your knitting project. So gauge is simply a measurement, right, of the way that you are knitting. It tells you how many stitches and how many rows fit into usually a 4x4-inch square of knitting using number 1, a specific yarn, number 2, a specific needle size, and number 3, a specific knitting pattern. So obviously it will come down to the pattern that you are going to use in the bigger project that you're trying to make. So let's say you are knitting something in garter stitch, whatever that could be. It could be a scarf. It could be, I made a whole cardigan out of garter stitch in a sweater before. Garter stitch is like the most basic and simple pattern that you can create because all you need is one stitch, which is the knit stitch. So like your very first stitch you're going to learn if you already have downloaded my beginner guide, 5 things you need to become a knitter, that is the stitch that I'm teaching you in there because it takes you such a long way. But let's go back to this. Let's say you want to knit something in garter stitch, you have a whole sweater pattern. Then of course your gauge swatch that you are going to create will also have to be in garter stitch so that you can compare the size of your swatch to what you're actually going to make. If your gauge that you create in a swatch does not match the pattern and the measurements that are indicated in the pattern, your entire project is possibly going to come out the wrong size. You may finish a hat and it fits your toddler instead of you. So ask me how I know. Seriously though, I have been there, and for me, in most cases where I skipped swatching, gauge swatching, which yes, I'm admitting it, I did think that it was unnecessary for a while, I usually am on the bigger side. So I would just be knitting away, not knowing what my gauge actually is. And then looking at the piece later, I'm like, wow, okay, that looks huge. And at that point, it was kind of late to undo the whole thing. I mean, obviously, you always can undo and unravel your knitting, but let me just say it. I don't find that fun. To me, having to do something over again completely after you've put so much time and effort in it, it's not exactly my favorite thing to do. So maybe you don't mind it, but I'm usually pretty happy when I get something off the needles and I'm excited to wear it. And if I had to just redo it all again, I don't know that I would want to do that. So that might be a moment for me to just kind of ditch the thing for a while and come back to it later. Once again, this has happened. So don't feel, embarrassed if you're like, yep, been there, done that. It's all good. This is why we're talking about it now. If you haven't, well then, congratulations on catching this episode when you did, because you may never have that issue. And if you're just starting out knitting, then take this advice to heart because it really can save you a lot of stress, a lot of frustration, And it can really just kind of make the whole experience a little bit better. Even though, yeah, it may not be the funnest thing to knit something that isn't your actual project before you have to dive in. But let me assure you, it doesn't take a long time. It's very easy to do, and it really is worth investing, maybe 15, 20 minutes into before you get into your actual pattern. Let's talk about how you do this, how you actually knit a gauge swatch without the stress and without feeling like, oh my gosh, I really just don't want to do that, right? A lot of beginners might get tripped up here and think swatching is something complicated or something that someone has to do when they're like a professional or much better at knitting, and not in the beginning. But it's not true. It's actually something that I highly, highly recommend especially for beginners to do. And the reason is that everybody has a different tension when they knit. So even with the same exact yarn and the same exact needle that the pattern tells you to use, or, the pattern never tells you to use something, the pattern just kind of recommends what you can use or what was used in the finished product that you can see in the pattern. Like there's usually a picture and, they're going to be like, oh, this particular piece was made from this yarn with this needle size. And that's what's recommended. However, number one, you might have a different tension than the person who made it. Number two, you might say, oh, I just don't want to use this yarn because I have this yarn at home and it's a very similar yarn weight, also known as thickness, right? Meaning you can absolutely use that, but you do need to make sure that you're matching the gauge inside of the pattern in order to truly get the result that you're looking for. So let's talk about how to do it. Normally, the gauge swatch and the measurements that you need to measure is a window of 4 by 4 inches. So now it depends, of course, on the thickness, the weight of the yarn, and the size of the needle that you're using, how many stitches it takes to create a 4 by 4 inch square. But generally, if it's not super duper thin yarn like fingering yarn, you can cast on about 20 stitches, maybe between 20 and 30 stitches, right? And then you're going to knit in the stitch pattern that is indicated inside the pattern. So you will notice when you look at a pattern, in the beginning, you'll have your materials that you need, and then it'll have maybe some abbreviations in there that you need to know, and then it'll have gauge, and it'll give you the measurement within that 4-inch window or 4 by 4 inch window, but it will also tell you like how many stitches and how many rows you're going to need. So it also will then tell you in this pattern. So it'll say in stockinette stitch or in garter stitch, or maybe there's a different pattern that's in that, in that project, and it'll let you know about that too. So make sure you match the pattern, the stitch pattern, to what it says in your actual project pattern. Then you knit for about 5 inches. I always go a little bit bigger because it makes the measuring a lot easier in the counting. So don't knit a 4 by 4 inch square. That's a really important thing to let you know. I used to do that in the beginning. I was like, okay, let me just knit 4 inches and then 4 inches, right? So that I'm like right there. But if you're just slightly off, it's just very hard to measure. So for me, it's a lot easier when everything is about an inch bigger on each side. So you end up with maybe, like a 5 to 6 inch square, and then you can measure much easier. So you then do your knitting, get your rows in, and then you bind it off and you lay it flat. So you can block it, and we have talked about blocking here on the podcast in the past. It is just simply a way to kind of relax the fibers through steam or through washing it and then letting it dry on a blocking mat. You can just kind of give it a quick steam with your iron so that the edges are nice and flat, because also it makes the measuring of your stitches and your rows a lot easier. And then you're going to use either a ruler or a gauge tool to count how many stitches fit across those 4 inches and how many rows are fitting across the other 4 inches, right? So you'll have your little piece in front of you, and then you're going to measure up, where you're measuring how many rows you have knitted in those 4 inches. And then you're going to measure sideways from left to right, where you can then count the stitches that you have knitted in those 4 inches. And then you're going to compare it to your pattern. Quick word on the gauge tool. It's a very handy thing. I'm going to link it up in the show notes. I love using it. It's almost like it's just like a little window. So it's essentially it's a ruler, but it's a square shaped ruler with a little window in the middle, and that window happens to be 4 by 4 inches. So it's a very handy tool that you then just lay over your swatch that you just created, and then you can easily count within that window how many rows, so up from top down, top to bottom, and left to right, how many stitches you have made. Then those numbers need to be compared to the pattern. And if it matches roughly, like I would not be mad if I had one more or one less stitch in my little window. I would be okay with that. I am also okay with having just a little bit more or a little bit less than the rows that it indicates in the pattern. So if you're just slightly off, you are totally good to go. But if you do have significantly more stitches than the pattern says, you have to go up 1 needle size, because what it means is that you're knitting very tense, sorry, not tense, but you're knitting very tight, and you may have a needle that is just too small, and therefore it creates more stitches within your little pattern, within your little window. If you have fewer stitches, like I would say 2 or more, right, off of the indicated stitches in the pattern, you want to go down a size in your needles, because it means that you are knitting a little bit too large and you need to knit a bit tighter. Okay. So let me be honest with you. I used to skip this swatching in the beginning quite a bit. I literally just wanted to dive into the project, so I really understand. Like, I totally get it. But I also ended up with way too many things that didn't fit. And I actually one time I had to give a sweater away because it was way too big. And the funny thing is that it wasn't a sweater so when you knit a sweater from the top down and it's like all one piece, there is a way to just try it on as you go. And you would notice relatively early on, like, okay, something's off here. And you can also measure, the sleeves while you're wearing it and see how much longer you have to knit. So the fit or the fitting is a lot easier to achieve. But if you have a sweater where you knit each piece separately, so the front panel, the back panel, the arms or sleeves left and right, it sometimes is a bit hard to see until it's actually completed. And the thing was just like, it was crazy. I mean, it was literally like 4 inches too long on the sleeves. And I was like, what the heck did I do here? Oh, hang on a second. Yeah, no, I didn't gauge. So that was actually my wake-up call, that sweater, because my gosh, it was like such a pretty color. And I just loved the way it was cut. It was kind of a drop shoulder design. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't wear this. This sucks. And I couldn't give it to anybody in my family because it was going to be too big for them too. So I just donated it, which I'm hoping, someone got something out of it and they loved it, because it was a lot of work and I really enjoyed working on it, but I was pretty upset that I couldn't wear it myself. So that was when I was like, you know what? I'm going to take 10 minutes to swatch. It may not be my favorite thing to do, because I do really want to dive into a project when I, when I see one and when I'm like, okay, I'm ready to go. I'm casting on something new, but it's like, oh, okay, got to swatch. But I always remind myself of that particular story. That wasn't the only one, but that one was the one that kind of like felt, the most upsetting. So I'm like, okay, fine, I'll swatch. So don't let that be you. Be the person who swatches from the get-go, because you're like, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to waste any time. I want to wear the things that I actually make. But of course, once I started regularly swatching, my projects started turning out the way that they were supposed to. Thank goodness. So there really is truth to that, and it makes such a difference. And there's a reason why every designer who creates a pattern puts that into their patterns, right? Like it really makes sense. And then there's certain things that you may not need to swatch for, which is yay, amazing, right? We're all happy about that. But the things that you absolutely need to swatch for, and you'll notice too, when you see a designer on Instagram, they will make sure to tell you, like, hey, be sure to knit a gauge swatch for this one specifically, because it can be a little tricky in terms of the size. But what I think you definitely need to swatch for are hats. sweaters, cardigans, any project where the fit matters, right? And anytime, and this is a very important one, anytime you're substituting a different yarn than what the pattern calls for, because you may need a different needle size than what it says in there, depending on how, like how the yarn is different. Of course, there's great ways to figure out if a yarn actually is a good substitute for what you're using. And normally the weight and the length of the indication on the yarn label will give you a pretty good clue as to if that's a good substitution, but you still want to gauge swatch just in case, because there's no harm in going up or down one needle size really quickly if that's necessary. And it's really just 10 minutes, maybe 15 of prep that can save you literal hours of frustration. And also, just in case you missed the episode about yarn labels, since we were just talking about those, I just did one a few episodes ago. So if you scroll back in wherever you're listening to this podcast, you'll see we talked about yarn labels, what they indicate, what's important on there, and kind of what to look for. So if you didn't catch that one, go back to it, because it's really super helpful when it comes to gauge swatching and knowing exactly what yarn you have and how it fits into, the pattern that you're actually looking at, and seeing if you can use one of your own yarn that you already have at home. So here's a quick mindset shift for those who are like, I don't want to swatch. It's too much work. I'm just going to wing it and hope for the best. Swatching does not have to be a chore. It doesn't have to feel like, I don't want to do this. Make it part of your slow and mindful knitting routine. Like, think of it as your sort of mindless, I always say mindless. It really is mindful, right? But make it your little mini pattern that you can pick up whenever, because it's not very hard to do. You don't have to count rows. You don't have to, knit in a specific pattern where you have to change colors or do something else that requires focus. So just use it for a time where you're like, okay, I got to really pay attention to this other thing. My example is always when I'm downstairs in my kids' school area and they might have questions for me. I do not pick a pattern or a project that I'm working on that requires a lot of focus from my end. I pick a pattern or project that I'm working on that's relatively easy to do. And a gauge swatch is certainly one of those. But you can also use it as a nice mindful break in your day when you're like, wow, okay, I need to decompress right now. You can do that. You can just and you're like, oh, you know what? I'm going to make this little gauge swatch really quickly. It takes me 15, 20 minutes, perfect break. And that rhythm that you're going to have, because it's honestly sort of like a boring thing, right? But that's exactly what you're going to need in that moment to bring you back to peace and to give your brain that break of going 100 miles an hour. You need something that gets you focused, right? That gets you to calm down, that calms your nervous system. We talked about this last week on the episode about the dopamine reset. This is the perfect thing for it. Put on a podcast, put on some music, make a cup of tea, settle in with your new yarn that you're about to use for a big project, and then enjoy the process of actually, meeting the yarn before you fully commit to that project. It's a great way to say, you know what? Let's just see how this feels in my hands. Let's see how this knits up. That gauge swatch is like a first date with your yarn. It's actually amazing. So I'm hoping that helps you, with your mindset of thinking, oh, this is a chore. Oh, this is something I don't want to do. This takes so much time. Use it in a very beneficial way, and it changes the game. So if all of this still feels a little fuzzy, I've got you covered. You can grab my free checklist called 3 Things You Need to Start Knitting for all the things that I highly recommend when you are new to knitting, when you're just starting out. It has links in there to go straight to the things that I highly recommend, that I love for beginners, because there are so many things out there. I think the best is just to cut through the noise and have a list of things that are the best when you first get started, instead of being completely overwhelmed by all the yarn and the needles and all the things that are out there. It also comes with the handy glossary, which I can't talk about enough, because it's exactly what I was missing when I first started knitting, or back, when I first picked knitting up again about 5 years ago, and in a different language. mind you. I was like, what the heck? So the glossary was like my lifesaver. It would have been, I guess, because I didn't have one. So I created one for you, the beginner, who is like totally confused by knitting lingo. So it has all the good stuff in there, abbreviations and, things that what we call things so that you're not confused. So that's totally free. You can get it at thenittingmamas.com/start. And for even more step-by-step help, if you are really kind of getting into it and you're like, okay, I sort of have an idea how to do this, but I would love to have like someone hold my hand. The Become a Knitter in 5 Simple Steps guide is the perfect fit for you. Walks you through all the beginner essentials, including how to swatch as well, and the beginner stitches, how to bind off, how to cast on. You got the videos in there. Everything is there, and it's only $17. And you can grab it at thenittingmamas.com/guide. So next time you feel tempted to skip the swatch in your next project, again, unless it's a scarf, infinity scarf, a blanket, you probably don't have to swatch for unless you're using a totally different yarn weight, then I would totally do it. But next time you feel tempted to skip it, remember this. It isn't about being perfect. It's about giving your project a fighting chance of actually fitting, right? And you deserve to actually wear the thing that you knit, but for that to happen, it has to fit. And then it's going to feel so amazing because you get to wear it and it's going to make you feel so proud. So thanks for joining me today right here on the Knit Your Stress Away podcast. I will see you next week with more bite-sized knitting and stress relief wisdom. Happy knitting and, of course, happy swatching. Can't wait to see your swatches. If you like, you can tag me on Instagram at @thenittingmamas_ and I will share it away with the others. All right. Talk to you next week. Thanks so much for hanging out with me on today's episode. I hope you're walking away with a bit more inspiration and a few ideas to make your self-care a priority. If today's chat gave you a little boost, I'd love it if you could leave a 5-star review on iTunes. This helps other moms discover the podcast and start finding more calm and creativity in their day as well. And don't forget to join us over in the Knitting Mamas community on Facebook by going to thenittingmamas.com/group. Thanks again, and remember, you deserve time for yourself to recharge and feel your best.